Alright, another draft physics video presentation. More light, I think. Mostly. No useful comments, I don't think. But anyway, Ken Wheeler video to play just for references, just for points of interest, as conversational points, but no, you know, the content is vacuous and mushy. But I did think I should go over this one more time and make a request to the debunkers, the claimers of the defenders of the bullshit. Just link me, please, to the video presentation of light interference that is all complete, in terms of actually explaining what's causing the phenomenon. I mean, being able to draw the geometry actually in more detail than saying, look, if you have two different angles and you have an angle, it goes in a new direction, actually correlating the pattern. So I'll just go through the things that they don't say that they should be saying, and I'll ask these people to explain why don't they explain that that's what it's really doing. Because it is what it's doing, and they should explain it the way it's actually happening, not the wrong way. And all this misinformation, I read a couple of the comments on Ken's video. It is a very unusual, it's 5 years old, and it has, more dislikes than likes, which is really unusual. And I thought about it, and I said, yeah, well, all the sycophants of Ken show up early and thumb it up, and then over time, because it has double-slit experiment in it, in quotes, and because he has, whatever, 200,000 subscribers, the video's promoted on the subject and linked, and then people who know something about double slits see the video and thumb it down. So, but why is the science so mushy? Why all this misinformation? Why all these diverse statements about the reality? Shouldn't physics have figured this one out and gotten it solid? Especially since it's the cornerstone of their whole quantum mechanic theory. Alright, so let's just go through it one more time. Now, what they should be saying, all the physicists should agree, is that this slit experiment really can't be viewed on a straight line, a wall. Just like a movie can't be projected on a straight wall. If you're going to have a widescreen movie and you're going to project it on a straight, flat screen, you're going to get people are going to get really fat over here. Like, they'll be like Ken Wheeler types over here, and and they'll be the right size here, nice, normal, human, happy. La 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 la, balloon, I have a balloon because I'm happy. And, they're not going to be so happy over here because they're going to have a bad self-image. So, obviously, the thing shouldn't be projected on a flat screen. It should be understood that this is the screen you have to project it on, one that's equidistant, from a point. Equal distances here and here. And the real point of that is that when you do this geometry, it's not really going to be about, even their mathematics doesn't, cut the slit in half and say the point sources are here and here. It is here and here. And all you're really doing, again, this is really simple, is the two lines have the same distance here. Now that's another thing that you should just point out, right? Is I can show you all the Google images where they, say, hey, one lump goes here and one lump goes here. Well, on the screen, this difference in location, wouldn't be inches. It's tiny. It's 1 millimeter. 1 millimeter difference in the two patterns. They should be right on top of each other. So, they can't, even simple geometry, the stuff that if they got it wrong on the test, if I gave them an A, B, C, D test, multiple choice test, and I said which pattern is correct, they'll get it wrong. If I say, okay, is the pattern, when I open one slit and then open the other, is the pattern like this, or is the pattern, this nonsense? The two way away from each other, when there's only a millimeter difference in where the slits are. Alright, anyway, back to this important straight line stuff. So here, the 2 point sources are the same distance. And obviously here, the 2 point sources are different distances. Okay, and all through that process, right? So if we take the longer line and just put this, okay, over the edge, you can get the idea that at this point there's this much difference between the two lines. Here there's a little less, a little less, a little less, a little less, a little less. And this difference, okay, is exactly what's creating the pattern, because these are all notches on the ruler, so to speak. These are all the wavelengths that are in here. So whatever number of wavelengths, the number of, lambdas you have here, wavelengths in here, that's going to tell you how many of these you have, where they're on phase, off phase, on phase, off phase, on phase, off phase. And that's all there is. And so by knowing how many wavelengths of difference there is between this location, right, and this location, the surfaces. So Ken's going to use, well, let me just finish this argument. So that noise isn't helping at all. So irritating. I'll be back. I should pause it. Eesh, trying to get a little warm temperature in here. Not allowed to. Now this thing's doing that crap. Stop it. Eesh, it's always something. All right. So the difference in the distance is dictating how many of these notches you have to use up over this entire space, and that explains the pattern. I mean, the pattern is sending equally sized notches to all these locations. So there's a little blip of light here, and a blip of light here, and a blip of light here, and a blip of light here, and they're all the same size. And it's only when you project them that you start distorting them. So obviously, this is the way to understand it. This makes the impression that the pattern has an infinite potential. Shooting to a straight line ends up with infinities. This, understanding it this way, gets rid of all the infinities. So this is sort of a Lorentz transformation. Is to understand it, you have to transform the image onto the proper viewing screen to see it the way it really is, and not to see it distorted. So this gets to like relativity arguments and everything else, but that's what they come down to, is fake infinities, because you're simply not displaying the effect in the universe it's affecting, which is always a universe coming from, in a lot of cases, a point source. And you can't judge the strength of something coming from a point source with the wrong surface. It'll give you a misimpression, because it gives you distance changes, and those can fool you into thinking something that isn't true. So again, we allow people to think it's an infinite pattern. Lots of things that people have the misimpression because they never detail it properly. So the point is Ken's doing the opposite experiment in this video. So he's going to just take and do the single impediment, a needle, and he doesn't show it very well. But the idea is yes, you end up with the same phenomenon, but you have a surface, and the surfaces have a distance from each other. And so you're still creating the two different lines. You're creating the two different sources that when the lines combine, their difference is going to be built into how many wavelengths fit inside the opening or the impediment. The more wavelengths you have inside, the smaller the little bars of light, and the fewer wavelengths you have, the bigger they are, because they all have to fill this space. So if I have just 3 of these little notches, then the 3 notches will be this size. Well, I didn't draw that perfectly, but you get the point, right? So they'll all be big, okay? And if I have more distance, then I have more potential for wavelength differences, and therefore they'll get smaller and smaller and smaller, depending on how far apart the two slits are. And obviously if I make them very far apart, they get so close together that you could never even see them. And so that's the way the experiment should be explained, and that it's always doing this. So this works for the single impediment, this works for the single slit. It works for the double slit because now you have 4 sources and you can understand. See, they can't draw. Their theory doesn't provide them any way to draw it accurately because the 2 waves aren't going to be a representation of the fundamental difference. So this is a way you can understand their theory has to be wrong. Okay, because we know the pattern is irregular in that it has the 2 patterns are built in. So you have this and then you start with this. So the double slit pattern creates 2 patterns. One pattern superimposed on another pattern. So you know this can't work. You know, this theory of 2 waves interfering will not do that. And what might do it, okay, in some theoretical way, is if you could organize the waves in a different way, like have one wave come out here and one wave come out here. But that won't do it either, okay, because this, making a big wave, doesn't create the small pattern. So it's not going to help you any. You need something that's going to make a small wave to create this small pattern. So there's really no way to draw it to make sense from what they understand. But the way to understand the math is to understand this is how the math is done, by understanding that this is one source for pattern that makes this pattern the small dimensions, and the wide dimensions, the longest lines, the longest distance that has the most wavelengths in it, that one's creating these little fellas here. So these 2 outside contributions are what's creating the little blocks, and the 2 inside contributions are creating the big blocks. And so you're really at a location, you're combining, you're adding this pattern that might be invisible on its own to these 2 sources. So you're adding the 2 sources coming from here. They're making this pattern. I'm going to do a dotted line. I don't know. I'm not Professor Lewin. Whoops, I did it from the wrong location. So you're adding the pattern here, creating this little hump from this source, these 2 sources, and then you're combining it with the contribution from here. So this one might be invisible if it wasn't for the fact that you have opened another slit and created now 4 sources. So you went from 2 to 4. Now another way to look at that is you could say there's one source and that the single slit offers you another source, one more source, so that you have 2 places the light can come from, right? And then when you add another one, you're adding 2. So you had 1 extra source, and when you open the second slit, now you have 2 extra sources. So you now have 3 more sources, which means you doubled it. You didn't just, or quadrupled it in the case of the final result. In terms of the more sources you have, the more potential you have to create pieces that are in phase. And that's all, you know. I don't have to even go into what a photon is and that it's broken by the process and all that. You don't need any of that theory to say, why don't they teach this as being the truth when it actually is the truth? It is how it works. And the reason they don't is because it's not consistent with drawing waves. Waves won't work. You have to understand them as point sources, not waves. Point sources going in all directions, going to all places. All right, enough of a context. So we'll play a little Ken Wheeler. Now, to understand, this is a terrible demonstration. I mean, it's just horrible. He has hundreds of thousands of dollars of camera equipment. He has cameras that can do slow motion, cameras that can do infrared. Right now, wouldn't it be really interesting getting an infrared image of the double slit pattern? See what an infrared camera sees. That would be interesting, right? Now, it doesn't seem very complicated, right? That we don't have an infrared image of a single or double slit, pattern. Yeah, it seems like something they should be able to do. Another way of sensing temperature in a way. I mean, obviously the reflected light would be a little bit problematic, but especially if you did it in green light, it would be really interesting to see, because you wouldn't get the reflected green light anyway. And you could just see how much infrared radiation is coming from the surface. And it'd be interesting to see if the pattern is much, much blurrier, which I would predict it would be. Okay, so let's play this and such.
Okay, I want to show you something that you've never seen before.
Okay, so the first automatic bullshit, like Ken Wheeler invented it. Yeah, not even close. Years and years, long before. I mean, Newton did the experiment, for fuck's sake. So let's not even. We shouldn't even be having this conversation. I mean, this is a Newton experiment, and so this is all kind of silly. Yes, obviously, in the popular culture, there was so much emphasis on openings, that no one paid attention to just obstructions. But yes, obstructions will create the same type of pattern. Just the truth. It'll create a a single slit pattern without as bright a center.
I'll show it to you in a second. I have a precision laser pointer, not a crap laser pointer, but a precision one that is...
Frankly, it works better with less light than more light, to tell you the truth from my own experience. So, frankly, you don't really want a precise laser.
It's about 5 inches away from a needle, okay? It's not shining through the eye of the needle, but the body of the needle.
And it's a big, fat needle, which is a little bit of a problem, right? Because the fatter the thing you use, the little smaller the little bands of light are, and therefore the harder they are to see. So in a sense, you want to use kind of a small impediment, not a big one, to get a nice visible pattern.
So unlike the double-slit experiment, which supposedly proves wave-particle duality nonsense, this proves just the opposite.
Well, whatever wave-particle prove, you can't prove wave-particle duality because it's already a mushy compromise. It's two different things. You're not going to prove it's a flying pig. You're either going to prove it's a bird or it's a pig.
And let me show you. Let me come up here and let me block out the major part of the beam.
Yeah, it's just such an impressive demonstration, right? I mean, so clearly see it. It's just really brilliant. Really sucks.
Here, so you're able to see it. I'm using a white card reflector. Here you'll see constructive and destructive interference pattern.
I mean, it doesn't even display it on a consistent background, which is funny. Puts up a huge giant screen for this little tiny dot. Not very impressive.
Along the spread of the laser. Now, there aren't any slits in this laser experiment. No, none. Actually.
And neither were there any slits when Newton did it with pieces of hair and stuff like that. So, yes, we all know this already. This is all part of the historical fact.
My laser beam turned off. Hold on a second here. Let me turn it back on. The premise of this is that the supposed double-slit experiments that proves the assumed wave-particle duality...
So he says it again when that's really not what they're using it for. The real key ingredient is the idea that the sources somehow change when you open a second slit. So the real key one for the quantum mechanic theory isn't just the idea that, okay, it sort of has something in similar with waves in the sense that it creates a pattern. So they say, well, that's enough. But the real key one is that I open a second slit in a place where photons were going. I mean, photons were going somewhere with one slit open. I open another slit, add more light. And somehow by adding light, I made the place darker. That's the thing they have to demonstrate or prove. And then that proof would be, yes, there's something magical happening. I mean, when a photon disappears because you added more photons, that's a dramatic fact. Now, if they can establish that as a fact, then you could say, okay, they have some reason to go on their little, let's make up almost any kind of voodoo to explain it. But the fact is they never did establish that as a fact. They just assumed it as being, well, it looks sort of like it. And that's all it had to, all it had to do was look a little like it.
Nature of light is absolute bunk. It doesn't exist. I mean, nobody understands the whole notion of wave-particle duality is the entire premise behind quantum mechanics.
Okay, so again, it really isn't. That was just a silly compromise because they had to concede some experiments look like a wave and some experiments look an awful lot like a clump. And so that's just a concession to the fact that the experimental evidence is inconclusive. So they came up with some kind of, well, it's like somebody being brain dead or something. Well, they're sort of dead, but yeah, their flesh is still alive. You know, so technically, yeah, they're alive. Their cells are all happy. They're all saying everything's just fine for me. You know, but the whole idea of being a consciousness and all that kind of, well, that's all fucked. You know, so there can be these gray areas or something. Something can be a zombie. And so they turned photons into zombie particles because they weren't sure what exactly they're doing. And but instead of saying they're not sure, they decided to say, well, let's make a confident definition of not sure, which is we really think it's all waves. We'll just concede that, oh no, sometimes it's a particle, but we don't pay any attention to that. We don't like that part.
Quantum physics. Now, neither general relativity nor quantum mechanics has ever defined a field, and of course light.
So more mush. Of course, it's defined it as something that does something, and it has some capacity to do something that makes the universe a different place. So it changes something. So it's a field of change. You could say that. So they have some definition. I agree that it's mush. You know, this whole jello perception, that's where it's just jellify everything. Everything's some layer of jello.
Is not merely a transverse electrical and magnetic perturbation, which of course has absolutely no quantity whatsoever.
Alright, so this whole perturbation thing, this perturbation theory, I'm just going to argue for simplicity and say, I don't know why people are so attached to it. It goes back to some sort of Tesla is God, and so we must believe everything Tesla believed, or some kind of crap like that. I don't know why people are so glued to it. But the catch of it is that you do know that this perturbation, this cause, can be a relatively small thing, and it has to, travel, generally speaking, a straight line as it perturbates. And the problem is if you put an ether in here, there's no way to arrange the ether. You can't make it out of squares, you can't make it out of circles, you can't make it out of anything that allows it to be able to create these straight lines. Where all the little perturbators would be in a row, and you could hit one and it would perturbate through all of them in a straight line. There's no way to arrange that where the straight lines are straight in all directions. So there'd be like obvious distortions, like some things would go really straight and if I shot it this way, but if I shot it a little bit different, then all of a sudden it would go kind of crookedy because it would be perturbating, the matrix of your medium wouldn't be lined up and it would start pushing things in the wrong direction. And so it really doesn't work. And the only thing you're saying can't be possible is, you're saying there has to be dominoes that you're flipping over, and you're saying it's somehow impossible that that the real universe can be dominoes, but the dominoes themselves just go. They don't need to hit other dominoes. You just flick it with your finger, and the domino flies over there. I mean, that's all you have to do is say, okay, no, I don't need all the extra dominoes. I'll just have the domino move the speed of light, and then I solve the problem. Just saying. It seems a simple solution to, your medium thing. Because your medium just isn't going to work. If you're going to make it a medium that can spread a whole wave, that can take a little energy and spread it, then you really can't. You're just as guilty as wave-particle duality if you're saying it spreads, but it doesn't spread. It goes in a straight line. You can't have a medium that can do both things and make any sense. There's not enough energy in the perturbation to perturbate everything and then decide to just end up in one place. It doesn't make any sense.
However, it also has a z-axis radio-dielectric component. This is actually
z-axis electrodielectric component. It's coaxial cable and it's blah 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 blah. What?
This premise, although it was never said, preempted Oliver Heaviside to create the coaxial cable.
Something very it's not very complicated. Once you know the existence of these idea of there's this electromagnetic radiation all around us, all over the place, and that your metal wires are conductors for that radiation, it seems to make sort of sense that you put the ground wire around the core wire and that will shield it like a Faraday cage, it will shield that wire from the noise. Gee, I mean, that's, I'm not saying you shouldn't give people credit for inventing things, but this is sort of round wheel invention. You really can't give somebody the Einstein Award. Well, maybe you can, because Einstein's kind of a round wheel, a square wheel here. But, you wouldn't sort of Nobel Prize that kind of stuff. It's just like, oh yeah, if you didn't think of it today, somebody about 6 hours later was going to think of it. It's so freaking obvious.
Turn the light off again. I actually had to tape the switch down to keep the laser on. Since it's a precision laser, it doesn't want to be kept on.
Yeah, because it's a precision. No, because it's a laser pointer, retard. They have an on-off button that you push because it's really easy to turn it on and off. That you don't have to move the switch or anything. So it's a push button, retard. Like all lasers, pointers. Oh God, he has to turn everything into some magical story. Everything. My stuff is so much better than my lenses are radioactive, and that makes so much more Baku. Whatever Baku is.
For obvious reasons. But let me come up here and show you again. The double-slit experiment supposedly proves, let me block out the major beam of the laser here, so you're able to see it.
Well, let's understand, the single slit is the more miraculous experiment in the sense that, what the fuck? There's no waves to interfere with each other. It's a single slit, creates a nice round wave. There's no interference. How the hell is it making a pattern? So that's the harder one to explain. But the double slit, because of the fact that it creates the two patterns, then they can make this accusation that, look, I open a second slit and light disappears. Something that was light goes dark. That's the miraculous, how the hell do you explain that? Well, you don't have to when it's not true, just like the lensing images from space and lots of the other crap. You don't have to explain it because it's not really true.
And you'll see, I'll drop a white card behind it. The further I get back to, the more the interference pattern spreads apart, but you're actually able to see.
I mean, it's amazing he published this video. I mean, it's bad enough that he couldn't figure out what he's seeing in the camera is useless. But then after he made the video, he still said, oh yeah, I'll publish this anyway, even though it's so bad. Now, I think he did later make another one with a needle, and he actually showed the patterns. He could figure out how to use one of his hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of camera equipment to actually take a picture of something. Just, But like I said, he does have $10,000 infrared cameras. Why didn't you take an infrared picture? Let's see what these patterns look like in infrared. Use a green laser and take an infrared image, and let's see what you get.
Here. Okay. You can perform this experiment you want if yourself if you want, but you'll actually see red line, black line, spreading out along either side of the main beam where it reconverges around the needle.
Yes, thank you. I guess I have to do it myself. Yes, I have done it myself. I mean, I could, there's no point in displaying the same images over and over again.
And since it's coherent perturbation.
Coherent perturbation, so whatever that means. And they're all lined up, I guess, is what that means, and they're, same phase.
Never do this with your camera, by the way. I'm doing this with a point-and-shoot camera, okay? Which, of course, still...
Which absolutely sucks. And again, there's no huge threat to your camera, frankly. Unless you're reflecting it off of a mirror. The light intensity projected, especially when you're doing it blocking, the middle of the light, isn't nearly... I mean, you're more likely to ruin your camera with glare from the sun than you are a projected image of a laser pointer. I mean, shining a laser directly into your camera would be a bad idea, but a reflected image isn't a big threat.
Matters, but never shoot laser light with a DSLR camera, as I told you in a couple of other videos. But since we're talking about a cheapo point-and-shoot camera, it's no big deal. But you're actually able to see it there, okay?
I mean, you could just understand. Anytime you take a picture even close to like the sun, there's there's a meter space that goes out into space, from each location to the sun, and that your camera is ending up collecting light from hundreds or millions of those meters as you go higher and higher in the atmosphere, so you're collecting lots of photons. I mean, your camera deals with it.
Let me turn the light on and I'll prove to you what is behind the camera. It's exactly what I said that it is. And has general relativity or quantum mechanics ever done this experiment? Why, no.
Well, what they haven't done is, yes, the science of physics doesn't have any integrity. It doesn't have like its Royal Institution thing or something, someplace you go where they do all of this stuff and they collect the data and they have like an encyclopedia of physics, some sort of real effort to define their science and define what has been established and what hasn't been, some sort of real editorial control over where the physics goes and what can be said with authority and what can't be and all that kind of stuff. So they haven't exercised any discipline, and they certainly haven't had any devotion to these foundational experiments. All the physicists seem okay with the story they're told, and so they go through their life saying, I don't have to shore up any of these assumptions I have about this wooey theory. And so they just build on the woo. They just accept the existence of Jesus, and then they try to find more details about how big Jesus' feet were, or how tall Jesus was, or what color hair or eyes Jesus had. But they really don't want to spend any time figuring out whether Jesus is the right story, whether he was the actual Messiah.
They never have, because it disproves the entire basis of the wave particle duality nonsense. Let me come over here.
No, it disproves if you analyze the experiment with a little more depth than he did. The fact that there's a pattern with a single impediment, again, is just not new information. So anybody who knew anything about physics knew that happened. The question is how do you create one coherent theory that explains the single impediment, the single opening, and then the double opening, and multiple slits? Can they do that, or have they done that? And they haven't created a single coherent theory that explains that. Their waves don't work. They're in the wrong place and they're the wrong size once you get to 2 slits or more. It doesn't work anymore.
Here, let me plug a light in really quick so that you can see by. Yeah, I'm kind of doing this on the fly. Get over it, deal with it.
Oh yeah, it's really terrible, but who cares? I can make terrible videos. Yeah, well.
Here we go. See, all I have is not shining through the eye of the needle. This isn't a regular laser pointer. It's actually a precision.
Yeah, bullshit. It's a little Chinese laser pointer. I mean, it's just absolute bullshit. I mean, you can buy it for $2.
Very narrow bandwidth laser pointer. Yeah, it's one of the old, really good ones that has a very minor beam divergence.
Sure. Yeah, it's huge beam divergence, if you notice. I mean, that's a giant spot from just 2 inches away. Gigantic.
Here we go. Some of the ones are actually slits. They're actually spread out a flat laser beam. This one's a single point. But the point is that I'm able to replicate.
Gigantic needle, by the way. I mean, a needle. It's one of his leather needles. I mean, it's not a needle.
Over here, there were the same results as the supposed double-slit experiment. It's like, well, I've removed the slits, the blocks and the slits, and so I get the same results. So what is this? The premise that light is a.
This is just great. Yeah, it's just wonderful, ugly as fuck background, by the way.
Is a wave and a particle is nonsense. This is absolutely BS. Tesla said it was BS.
Yes, everybody should be able to say that's BS. I mean, frankly. But again, let's concede when they say they're doing particle physics, we know it's not particle physics. They're really doing wave physics. I mean, as soon as you accept de Broglie as a rational statement, that somehow all things that are moving, that have velocity, have a frequency, you've already waverized everything.
Oliver Heaviside, of course, Charles Maxwell, and he didn't actually survive long enough to see.
Yeah, so he just said that anyway, and it's not about relativity, But he certainly wasn't alive in 1930 when they decided to do this duality bullshit.
Relativity take bloom, but Oliver Heaviside said that this was a brain-wasting disease. Tesla said it was bunko and nonsense. The point is that using a single...
Saying it's bunko and nonsense isn't much of a statement, frankly. So I don't know. I never heard any analysis by Tesla of light diffraction, frankly. I haven't seen it anywhere. I didn't see any comments by Tesla regarding two-slit experiments. Apparently didn't do any, which seems kind of amazing. I mean, it's a guy who played with X-rays routinely. You'd think he would have, played around with diffracting them.
Single bar.
So look at a huge, gigantic thing there.
You could have been thinner, the results are the same. Not shy.
Fat man with a fat needle. It's obviously not even a point on it. So, like I said, it's obviously for some other. It's not really a needle. Yeah.
Shining it through the, not shining it through the needle hole, the eye of the needle, but actually just across the bar. Able to replicate the exact same results as the double-slit experiment.
So exact, we know it's not exact. We know the double-slit has a specific character that has to be accounted for. Two patterns.
And this de facto disproves the premise of wave particle.
Okay, so this is more like this is unfortunately embarrassing to the entire fringe community of people who want to defend the truth and all that kind of stuff. The outsiders, the what's the word for them? The skeptics. It just makes us all look bad when people make these bold statements that are just as reckless and way overstated and hyperbolish as the people they're complaining about. So they're just guilty of exactly the same crime, jumping to conclusions, saying they've done all they need to do. I've proven it. Blah, blah, blah. Not enough.
Duality. See, additive and destructive coherent interference, and why the actual light bends around the needle. Obviously, the beam itself is fatter than the needle, but how it reconverges on the other side, kind of like a fat person, walking straight into a lamppost and splitting in two and then reconverging again at the other end as an analogy. How that happens is due to the coherent nature.
But that's really not the right analogy, because the opening is so much bigger than the polarization or the wavelength of the light. So you're walking through a brick wall. Is a more, it's a huge object that the individual photons are actually small by comparison to the size of the impediment. So there's many wavelengths, many fatnesses, of distance. So it has nothing to do with light going through a light post. It's not a proper analogy. It won't work. Doesn't accurately analogize polarization, the size of polarization and wavelength.
Of light. Light is an ether perturbation. As a light bulb, just like this light bulb here, does not emit light.
Which is just stupid. Of course it emits light, whatever you can say. Emitting light is a certain different thing. Just like you can't say there's no gravity. It's just stupid. There's obviously a phenomenon called gravity. There's a phenomenon called light emission. You want to say what it really is, fine, but it's still, the fact is that whatever happens there is moving here at a speed. So why pretend that isn't happening?
There's nothing emitted out of a light bulb. There's nothing.
I would agree in a sense, okay, because all that really you have to do is change where a surface is to change how it reflects the universe. So a photon is created just by electrons moving their position. By moving their position, moving away, that creates the empty space, right? That creates the quiet place between the elements of the photon. Then I move towards, now I'm creating the noisy place, the place where a lot of stuff is reflecting. I move my hand this way, I reflect lots of stuff. I move my hand away, I don't reflect anything. So yes, but clearly the stuff, the ether, the gunk that is making the nothing and then something and then nothing and then something, that is the frequency of the light, that's still something. And it's just silly to say it doesn't emit anything when clearly there's something hitting people. Water waves are not nothing. Right? I mean, it's actual water. If it hits you, it's water. it's kind of silly to say it didn't. It's no water hit me. No, something changed. Water hit me. No water hit me. Water hit me. Water didn't hit me.
Emitted out of a laser. Okay, this laser does not emit anything, neither does a light bulb. What it does do is it causes ether perturbation, which moves at the rate of c. But the rate of c is not constant; it's actually variable depending on the rate.
Right, and I would say that, generally speaking, I could agree with that if, the facts didn't indicate that there's no real way to make an ether, a substance that can move pressure, that can, for some silly reason, go from spreading the pressure to making the pressure go in one direction. It can't do that. It's like, unless you come up with some reason, somehow it knows when it's supposed to go everywhere and it knows when it's supposed to go just one place. How would that knowledge be incorporated into the substance of the ether? So until you come up with a decent theory for how the ether knows when something's supposed to spread in all directions and when something's supposed to just go in one direction, I think you're in pretty hopeless trouble with the ether theory.
Of induction through which it passes. How is this applicable to photography? Well, not very much so. This is a non-photography related video, but
yes, it certainly didn't have any good photography in it. All I concede is it couldn't have been less of a photography video. I mean, you're showing a tripod and showing some photography stuff, but yes, there was no photography in the video.
The higher the capacitance of the light, like towards the blue end of the spectrum, just like you pass sunlight through a prism, you'll notice that which is deflected more is the blue light because it has more energy. It is literally like a car.
Incorrect answer, I believe. The blue light is actually deflected less. So, I don't know. I don't know. Wrong answer. Alright, anyway, let's go to comments. Enough of the gibberish. We'll read some comments and just marvel at how broken the world is. When you use a needle to split the laser beam, didn't you in effect have two very wide slits? One on either side of the needle. Well, except the other surface is missing, so you still only had 2 point sources. So, no. Exactly, you don't need the holes, just a medium. So whatever that means, a median. This is the level of the ignorance, right? I mean, the 2-slit experiment to these people doesn't mean anything. It just means bars. They don't even get the fact that there's 2 patterns you have to explain. And, these are huge gaps in understanding. And I'm arguing that the huge gaps exist because all the pop physics is so trivial and it just sloughs right over the details and pretends it can tell a fake story as the real story. It's really terrible physics. And the fact that all these believers can't admit this, this is the comment I was looking for. I was hoping someone else would notice this. Notice what? Light waves bend around the needle. Boy, that's a huge contribution there. I'm thinking in the negative. Are you not just creating 2 large slits on either side of the needle? So again, there's somehow openings on either side of the needle. There's somehow another barrier to make a wave out of, to bulge the wave or whatever that would be. I mean, it's pathetically bad anyway. Deflection alongside the edge of the needle is the same as deflection on the inner edge of the slit. Now, there's a proper observation. Is that all it is a point source. And it's the same distance. Whether I make an impediment this big or I make a slit that big, it's the same difference. 2 surfaces at a distance from each other with a certain number of wavelengths that can fit inside that difference, and that creates a difference in the length of the line. And that's it. That's all you need to understand. One line is longer. I was just about to say the same thing. He in effect split the beam with the needle. Anyway, double-slit experiment was first demonstrated without slits, just a beam passing through a card. Well, no, I don't think that was the truth either. I can't remember what Newton used for his aperture experiments, but whatever, doesn't matter. All right, looks to me that you have no clue what you're talking about. So this is just the typical, vacuous mush. At which point did you seek to observe the path that the photons have taken? Dude, you are just wasting people's time. Well, it's a waste of time to tell the traditional story also, because it's also not fact-based. So that would be the argument. So he's no more guilty than your physics. The conventional theory is just as weakly evidenced. It's just as poorly photographed. It's just as poorly detailed. Tell your audience how to observe which path the photon takes. So again, where do we even get into this dispute about what path? The photons have choices and they choose paths. Sounds simple enough to demonstrate yourself. What materials and frequency of light emission is required? Theory does not mean fact. Well, yeah, it would have been nice if he pointed out that the wavelength of the light is, essentially dictating the size of the little blocks, because the wavelength is the same as the polarization, and there's only a certain number of them that can fit inside of the difference in the distance. And the difference of the distance is the only thing you have to create the phase changes. All right, you keep asking people to demonstrate it to you. Numerous experiments have been done to demonstrate the double-slit experiment. Unfortunately, all with silly analysis to go with it. You are aware that individual photons are fired and measured, and whether the path of the photons are measured or not determines the result of the experiment. So isn't that quite funny? I mean, to me, it's funny. So obviously we know that this whole notion of individual photons is more sloppiness, because it's a very tricky thing to send a single photon. The very idea of what a single photon is, a photon a frog can see or a photon a human can see. The nature of a single photon is in doubt. I feel like ours is on you now to prove that it doesn't produce the results that the many other scientists have now demonstrated occur, whatever that means. So many other scientists haven't really done that whole demonstrating thing with any kind of real integrity, because they do everything sloppy and they quote mine the experiments. They do the experiments to make it look like something. They don't do the experiments with a technical rigor. For example, like putting tones on the radar experiment. So instead of detecting the actual radar signal, they're detecting something where there's enough of the frequency of the tone is still intact. I can't see the pattern. Please repeat the zoom. yeah. And zoom in more. So funny. I really enjoyed this. But how could possibly somebody enjoy the frustration of not seeing what somebody's talking about? I mean, look at the Sasquatch image I got. I was sitting on a hill, and there, look at that. It's, you can't tell it from a duck. Anyway, anything purported as science with quantum in its name is a lie, a hoax, a deliberate attempt to manipulate our sense of reality. No, it isn't. Okay, it's just a religion. Regular physics is a religion. It has a whole big congregation and following, and they all like the little narrative of the quantum wooey fun. And that's all it is, okay? They're not malicious. They're just stupid, silly, and they have no interest in the truth. That's all, the only ingredients you need. It's a little bit of stupidity, a little bit of a recklessness, being a little bit sloppy, and, you're a bad doctor. And there's lots of doctors, I was supposed to take out their gallbladder and I took out their heart. I made a mistake. Wasn't paying attention that day. Alright, I don't think passing the laser through the body of the needle debunks the double-slit experiment. Well, it certainly doesn't, whatever the double-slit experiment is, it doesn't debunk it. Yes, that's true. But the whole wave theory is in doubt when you compare the two experiments, so that's for sure. It's a little hard to figure out why the light, going through the single slit, you got some chance of making one wave anyway. But going through an impediment, you don't have any real chance of making anything called waves. That's not going to create the bubble, the round wave you're looking for. I argue you still have two slits being the left and right side of the needle. So somehow they're still slits. They still create a bulged, I mean, this is, it's sort of, this is where they just don't care about the details. It doesn't have to match really that much. So, I mean, the idea of the impediment and the light is coming through, and the idea that it's going to create a bulged wave over here of some limited size, and one over here, just as if there was a surface here to also pull on this thing, right? If there's nothing to pull on this thing, then all you have is a wave that's changed its phase, right? I mean, if there's nothing pulling on this side, right? So if you're just pulling on one side, you would end up with just this at a different location, but it would be the same on both sides, so it wouldn't change the phase any, because you just end up with the same thing in a different location. So there's no reason to have a bulged wave. I mean, it's just, and again, if I just did the single slit, I'm just going to get one of those bulges, so I'm not going to have any way of making two of them. I mean, there's no logic to their theory. It really doesn't work. All right, so you're trying the double slit experiment without actually having two defined slits. Some sort of crazy con. UR equals your. Whatever. The whole point of the double slit experiment is that it changes from an interference pattern, waves, to a particle pattern, straight lines. Now, can that make any sense to anybody? When observed. Is that the whole point of the two slit? Wow. That's the whole point. Go look it up. No, I don't think so. Quantum eraser double slit experiment. Oh, here we go. Back to the polarization experiments. With the magic crystal. Not that science can't be done at home, but it has been done in extremely controlled conditions. So this is, more exaggeration and repeated around the world. No, none of this shit's been repeated, frankly. The magical Allen aspect beam splitter spinning device thing never been repeated. No reply. The reply is gone. Theora made a reply, but he had deleted it, I guess. Love reading all these questions and comments. Let's talk about how this relates to non-duality and awareness next. Just kidding, haha. Whatever. The single needle, that's kind of a useless statement. And such. Yeah, should be back. Sorry. Life calls and such. Probably enough of a video anyway. And so, let's say, till next time. And, I don't know if it's worth changing the subject for a little while just to emphasize the point that, this is a foundational experiment. They really don't have evidence to support their exaggerated it is claims when it barely looks like. Would be asking almost too much. It's barely wave-like. And it's very much like vector-like from point sources. And the point sources are the surfaces. I mean, again, it's the two-surface experiment and the four-surface experiment and the multi-surface experiment. And that's how it really should be described if you're going to be honest. Just like it should be the speed of force, not the speed of light. These are all. They're elemental and fundamental mischaracterizations that physics depends on. And as long as they keep the rhetoric closed and they can control what words mean, the whole thing is going to be veiled in mush. Just like the idea of the photon as a single object is, you can prove that not to be a correct theory, a correct use of vocabulary. All right, anyway. So, till the next time and such. It's not going to work. No, that's not what I want. Come on. This button here, yes. Come on, I clicked on it. Why don't you give me options here? Oh, you have to right click, retard.